like to welcome you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. My name is Thalia Sparling, and I'm the technical manager for this session on women's empowerment in agriculture and nutrition, which will be chaired by Misbah Bagamwala. Thank you for taking part in ANH2021, and we really look forward to having an interactive and important session today. So a quick reminder that everything that you might need to access the conference and materials, including the program, can be found on the ANH Academy website at anh-academy.org/ANH2021. So before Misbah takes the conversation forward, I have a few technical announcements to ensure that our experience is as smooth as interactive as possible. So firstly, this session will be recorded and it will be posted to the ANH Academy website following the conference. Second, all participants have been muted, but please do introduce yourselves using the chat function. Let us know your name, where you are joining us from, and the organization that you work with. We encourage you to share your webcam video feed during this session so we can see your nice faces, but if your connection is bad, then we do recommend turning the video off. Later in the session, we will open up the conversation with a Q&A. If you have questions, we invite you to share them in the chat box throughout the session, and we will do our best to raise them during this Q&A. Lastly, if at any point you experience technical issues, please check your audio settings and your internet connection, and then you can always try to reconnect to the session using the Zoom link. If you have a technical question, please send me a private message using the chat box. Okay, over to you, Misbah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining this session. My name is Misbah Bagamwala, and I work with the Systems Analysis for Nutrition team at the World Food Program, and I'll be chairing this session today, which has a fantastic lineup of speakers. And on a personal level, I'm quite excited to be here because many of the studies being presented here use the project level Women's Empowerment for Agriculture Index, or the ProVEA, which a few years ago I had the privilege of working with the excellent team behind this piece of work. So today we'll get a chance to first hear about the ProVEA and its application to a portfolio of projects, which will be followed by a series of presentations from different countries where the ProVEA or one of the other versions of the WEA has been used to assess impact of on women's empowerment of different types of nutrition-sensitive agriculture food security programs. We have about 75 minutes for the entire session, and we have 6 speakers. So each speaker has about 8 minutes to speak. We have joining us today Agnes Guzenbing, Jessica Heckert, and Neha Kumar from the International Food Policy Research Institute, or IFPRI, Gianna Bonis-Profumo from Charles Darwin University, Solange Cullen from the University College Cork, and Anya McCarthy. So yeah, as I said, each speaker speaks for about 8 minutes, and after that we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A and discussion. So while the speakers are speaking, I encourage you to write your questions in the chat box, which will be presented to the speakers after the 6 presentations are done. So yeah, without any further delay, I want to introduce our first speaker of the day, Dr. Agnes Guzenbing from IFPRI, who will present on behalf of our colleagues a paper titled "Do Agricultural Development Projects Reach, Benefit, and Empower Women Using ProVEA and Impact Evaluations of the GAP2 Portfolio?" And that's also going to help set the scene for the other presentations that are coming up later. So Agnes, over to you, and your time begins now.
Thank you, Misbah. Let me now share my screen. And hopefully this will work. So I'm really excited to present this work from the Gender, Agriculture, and Assets Project Phase 2, or GAP2, which uses the newly developed project-level Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, ProVEA, to assess whether agricultural development projects reach, benefit, or empower women. So my name is Agnes Guzenbing. I am a Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI, and I'm one of the 3 co-PIs of this project. So as Misbah noted, several of the GAP2 partner projects are in this session, and Misbah herself was involved in the review of project strategies that gave rise to the Reach, Benefit, and Empower framework. So what is this REACH Benefit and Empower framework? So agricultural development projects typically have three types of goals. Some work to reach women, to include women in program activities. Some programs go one step further and focus on how to benefit women by increasing their well-being, such as through increased food security, income, or health outcomes. Going beyond this, other programs are designed to empower women. These types of programs aim to strengthen women's abilities to make strategic life choices and to put them into action. To do this, projects must have the appropriate strategies, but to know that it's actually happening, we must use appropriate indicators. So the project level Women's Empowerment Agriculture Index, ProWEA, is our attempt to come up with this metric. Like the original WEA, it's a survey-based index. It's based on interviews of a woman and man in the same household. Unlike the original WEA, it assesses empowerment in a project context, so the woman respondent is likely to be the project beneficiary. It has 12 indicators mapped to 3 domains of agency: intrinsic, instrumental, and collective agency. And as part of GAP2, 13 agricultural development projects in Africa and Asia co-developed and piloted ProWEA. These projects use crop and/or livestock interventions to improve household income and nutrition, and all of them also employ strategies to empower women. As I always say, there is no ProWEA without the projects, and more info can be available at wea.ifpre.info, the WEA Resource Center. So we analyzed project strategies in terms of which ProWEA indicator they were most likely to affect. The initial work in which our dear session chair was involved was mapping the project strategies first. But in this second stage, we look at what indicators they affect. So in the left panel, we have all the projects together. In the right panel, we split them up by region: Africa on top and Asia at the bottom. We found that most project strategies focus on instrumental agency, such as increasing input in productive decisions, asset ownership, and credit. A few project strategies address self-efficacy, and some, which work through women's groups, of course, promoted group membership. So autonomy in the control of income is the indicator with the fewest associated project strategies. So the core of our evaluation was to find out whether these projects in fact empower women. So the projects used ProWEA in baseline and endline, although with some variation in design, to look at the estimated impacts of the projects. So in this slide, our unit of observation is a treatment arm, and if a project had multiple arms, each treatment arm is considered a case. We have more observations of women's outcomes, which is on the upper part of the graph, than on the bottom, than men's outcomes on the bottom, because some projects didn't collect or compute men's outcomes. What is very striking here is the prevalence of insignificant or null results. That's the outlined blue bar in the center. For women's empowerment outcomes, many projects didn't have significant outcomes, whether positive or negative. But many projects also did have positive and significant impact on women's outcomes, and there were few, very few, significant negative outcomes. For men's empowerment outcomes, most impacts were insignificant. There were a few positive and a few negative. Now, since many of these projects didn't really aim to change men's empowerment status, why are we bothering to measure them? Well, we need to look at what's happening to men to make sure we know what's going on within the household, because there might be backlash. Okay, so in the next slide, we look at results from Africa on the left and from Asia on the right. What you see here is that there's really a lot of heterogeneity across regions. You have a higher number or proportion of insignificant results in Africa for women's outcomes and more positive impacts in Asia. And for men's outcomes, impacts are split between positive, negative, not significant in Africa, and generally null results in Asia, nothing going on. And where significant, but I don't show it in the slide, impacts on household gender parity are positive, except for one outlier in Africa, but there are fewer observations on gender parity because not all projects interviewed men. If we look at individual indicators, Africa again on the left and women on the right, we notice, Africa on the left and Asia on the right, we notice more cases with negative impacts on women's indicators in Africa. There are also negative impacts in Asia, but fewer. There are more cases of positive impacts in Asia, but plenty of insignificant impacts all over. And for men's indicators, which we don't show here, there are very few significant impacts in Asia and more cases of negative impacts in Africa, which we should take into account because of the implications for backlash. So I guess you asked, we went through all this trouble just to find all these insignificant results. So we went back to the project strategies and did a meta-analysis. And we found that having strategies related to an indicator was not significantly related to positive impacts on that indicator. It's possible that many projects that actually thought they were empowering women were just reaching and benefiting them and didn't really move the empowerment indicator. We did find that strategies to improve work balance and to increase the ability to visit important locations were not very effective in creating positive impacts, but may have prevented negative impacts. More projects and treatment arms had strategies affecting input in productive decisions and ownership of land and assets. But among these, only 6 to 7 cases reported significant impacts, which comprise less than 50% of cases with those strategies. So to conclude, I guess the first thing is to be open and say there's still a lot that we don't know. This is work in progress. And the prevalence of null results highlights the need to focus more on empowerment rather than assume that projects that reach and benefit women automatically empower them. We do find that having a common metric allows comparisons of empowerment impacts across projects and contexts. And to fully understand whether and why strategies work or not, we will need qualitative methods. Thank you very much. And I'm sure you'll find that the other specific project presentations are going to be very interesting and may answer many of the questions that you might have about this presentation as well. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Agnes. So next up, we have Jessica Heckert, also from IFPRI, and her presentation is titled, Can a Gender-Sensitive Integrated Poultry Value Chain and Nutrition Intervention in Burkina Faso Impact Women's Empowerment? So over to you, Jessica.
You're muted, Jessica.
Sorry, I thought I had unmuted myself, but apparently we all are still behind on our Zoom skills. So you just heard from my colleague Agnes about the development of ProWea. In this presentation, I'm going to report on more detailed findings from one of the studies that was mentioned, specifically the C'est la Vie project, which is an integrated poultry value chain and nutrition intervention that took place in Burkina Faso, and look at its program impacts on women's empowerment specifically. In brief, C'est la Vie was a nutrition-sensitive poultry value chain intervention. It aimed to increase the supply of poultry and eggs by training producers and connecting them with resources such as loans and vaccination services. Additionally, it aimed to generate demand for poultry products and other nutritious foods via nutrition counseling and BCC. Thus, the primary outcomes were those related to the diets of women and children, as well as poultry production, sales, and profits. Additionally, women's empowerment was a secondary outcome, and that's my focus today. There were specific gender-sensitive strategies, including community sensitization related to women's time use and their ability to manage resources. And then women were also targeted by the poultry value chain activities and a nutrition BCC. And additionally, there was a cadre of women village vaccinators who broke gender norms in this role and were intended to be role models. So to evaluate C'est la Vie, we used a mixed methods approach and a cluster RCT. There were 2 treatment arms, a C'est la Vie and a C'est la Vie wash intensive arm. I'm presenting the pooled results because for our findings today, there weren't substantial differences between the 2. We collected baseline data in March 2017. Endline data collection began in March 2020, was paused due to COVID and resumed later that year. Additionally, we collected lean season data in 2017 and 2019. We estimate program impact using ANCOVA models with looking at an intent to treat approach. And then we look at treatment on the treated using propensity score weighted regression analysis. To measure women's empowerment, we use ProWea. We look at 12 indicators separately for men and women, as well as the aggregate indicators of empowerment, and then also gender parity indicators. In the lean season, we collected a subset of these that were hypothesized where we'd see potential seasonal patterns. So self-efficacy and work balance were among those. So turning to our results, the figure on the left-hand side shows program impact on the continuous empowerment scores and the binary empowerment status for both men and women. We find no significant impact on either the binary or continuous version for women or men. On the right-hand side, we look at the size of the empowerment gap and whether gender parity was achieved in the household. Again, we find no significant outcomes, no significant program impact on gender parity indicators. So in analysis, when we're using ProWea, it isn't unusual to see impacts on different indicators going in different directions. And with things going in different directions, we could possibly wash out those effects by just looking at the aggregate. So it's important to look at impacts by indicator. And so that's what we do here. On the left-hand side, where we look at impacts on women for each individual indicator, and on the right-hand side, we show them for men. So on the left-hand side, the only significant finding we see is a negative impact on perceived mutual respect among household members. So this is unexpected. However, it's important to note that depending on how strict we are with multiple hypothesis testing, it does become no longer significant under some of those circumstances. So we really are looking into the best way to do this and would suggest this be taken with a grain of salt at this point. Such a finding might be due to an intervention where women are more aware of disrespectful treatment in the household, or more likely to report it. On the right, we look at indicators for men and find no significant impact on individual indicators. So in interest of time, I'm not going to specifically present on the lean season treatment effects or the treatment on the treated effects. But importantly, we don't see any program impacts when we look at those either. These are, of course, disappointing results, as we had hoped to see program impacts on women's empowerment and gender parity, and also leaves us with a really interesting work to do in terms of considering how a gender and nutrition sensitive market intervention could be improved so that there is an impact on women's empowerment. In this next slide, we approach that in one way by looking at ProWea diagnostics and looking at the contributors to disempowerment. So this shows the relative contributions in the different domains of empowerment, split by men and women in treatment and control arm. And it reveals that the largest contributors to disempowerment are access to and decisions on credit and financial services, work balance, and membership in influential groups. And these suggest redesigning such an intervention that really targets these aspects of women's empowerment. As these topics are also closely related to how one might design a market intervention approach. Of course, we want to know why there's no significant impacts on women's empowerment. The intervention was a light touch approach. It focused on providing information to producers and consumers and strengthening market linkages. There were no asset transfers, and this is a very resource poor context. We know that productive asset transfers have been a fundamental building block that is essential but not sufficient for agricultural development programs that aim to empower women. So it's really important to consider these findings in the context of sort of this larger asset transfer debate, especially when looking at a market-based intervention that targets poor households. Many funders and implementers are opposed to the idea of being perceived as a giveaway program, and it might be important to reframe this debate in terms of the types of contexts or the types of programs where asset transfers make an important and meaningful difference in program outcomes, specifically women's empowerment in this case. Additionally, we looked at the ProWea diagnostics to sort of refocus how we might retarget the program, potentially to focus on financial accounts and credit access, improving work balance, and encouraging memberships in meaningful groups for women. And these may be important steps forward for similar programs. So finally, I'd like to express our gratitude to our donors, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as well as A4NH, which is the CGIO research program for agriculture, nutrition, and health, led by IFPRI. And so I look forward to hearing your questions during our discussion time. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Next up, we move towards India, and we have Neha Kumar from IFPRI as well, presenting on the impacts of nutrition intensification efforts integrated into a women's self-help group-based livelihood project on women's nutrition evidence from India. So I see you've shared your screen, Neha, so over to you.
I did the same thing as Jessica, sorry. Thank you, hello everyone. I will be presenting on what Ms. Baja said. This is joint work with my colleagues at IFPRI and the larger WINGS study team. They don't seem to be, oh, there. Sorry. So this work is part of a larger project called WINGS, which stands for Women Improving Nutrition Through Group-Based Strategies, which is essentially to understand the pathways to impact from women's group-based interventions on nutrition outcomes for women and children. So this project had three components. The first, in which we developed a conceptual framework for us to better understand the different pathways from women's group-based project interventions to nutrition outcomes. And then we followed that up with an evidence review. The second component, which is what I'll be talking about today, is an actual impact evaluation of such an intervention. And lastly, the ultimate objective of the project is to highlight relevant lessons for investments in women's collectives, not only in India, but worldwide. Okay, so this is the conceptual framework we developed, which identified 4 potential pathways, which are identified by the horizontal blocks, which get triggered depending on the intervention components of the intervention. In addition, we also identified 3 cross-cutting pathways, which are around building social capital, taking collective action, and empowering women, which we believe that would get triggered because of the very nature of these projects, which are women's group-based. And in the current evaluation, we investigate impact of the intervention on nutrition outcome, but also along these pathways. So the intervention we assess is the impact of nutrition intensification intervention, which consisted of layering nutrition behavior change communication onto an existing women's self-help group intervention facilitated by a large Indian NGO called Pradhan. These messages were delivered at SHG meetings through trained volunteers called Poshan Sakhis. And in addition to these nutrition BCC messages, Pradhan also integrated nutrition in their other focus areas, for example, livelihoods, health, entitlements, and gender. And there was also additional community engagement and strengthening of higher level federations just to support the intervention. This slide gives an overview of the project. So it was in 8 districts across 5 states in India. And in each district, we chose 3 blocks. One was a control block where Pradhan was not active. One was a Pradhan standard block where the standard programming was happening, and one was a nutrition intensification block where this additional layering efforts were taking place. We have two separate data sets in our study. Today I'll talk about the panel, which was done, the baseline was done in 2015. This was a panel of ever married women aged 15 to 49 years old. And we followed them up at midline and also at endline in 2019. We also have at the midline, we integrated a detailed process evaluation, which we kind of draw on also in today's talk. Sorry. So in this evaluation, we make two kinds of comparisons. So we compare villages that are control villages with the Pradhan areas, which includes both the nutrition intensification arm as well as the standard arm. And that helps us answer the first question, which is about what is the impact of Pradhan's interventions on outcomes of interest relative to the control. We do a second comparison, which is between the NI arm and the standard arm, which tells us the added impact of nutrition intensification efforts over and above Pradhan's core model. And the primary outcomes of this intervention were women's body mass index and dietary diversity. So just very quickly on impact results, this is similar to what we've heard before. We don't find a lot of impacts. We find no impact on women's BMI or the likelihood of them being underweight. And this is true for both the comparisons, whether we do Pradhan versus control or nutrition intensification versus standard. Moving on to women's diets, we don't find impacts on total number of food groups consumed or any impact on minimum dietary diversity, which is defined as having consumed 5 or more food groups out of the 10. But we do find a small impact of consuming animal source food in the nutrition intensification arm compared to the standard. So an important question that came to us was, what is driving these null results? Could it be low exposure to the intervention or poor retention of messages that are being delivered, or a combination of the two? So analyzing the data, we find that exposure to intervention is consistently low. It's higher in the NI arm, but it's still pretty low. Exposure to messages around child feeding, around early marriage and pregnancy they are high, but they're uniform across the arms. And we find no impacts on knowledge. So to us, it seems like it is a combination of both. So we also examine impacts along the different pathways. And here we have some positive impacts on the agriculture and income pathway. Also observe some negative impacts on number of livestock owned, a positive impact on awareness on government entitlement schemes, but we don't find any impacts on women's empowerment, the individual indicators, or the composite score, despite an overall improvement over time in all areas. So we have some conflicting results in this evaluation, where we find that despite positive impacts on these pathways, we don't actually have impact on the final nutrition outcome that we were interested in. And so we try to explore our rich process evaluation data to come up with some key takeaways. So we realized that the average group member, who the intervention was targeted to, was not the right demographic for these kinds of messages. So they were older on average. And so, they weren't really the target group. They didn't care about these messages. And it was hoped by Pradhan that they will become agents of change, but there is very little evidence of any diffusion actually happening. But even with the right messages given to the right people, impact depends on intensity and the duration. So how many people were participating in these groups, how often, for how long, is it the right environment? The second thing is, these messages were delivered at the SHG meeting where there were only women. So, and it's not often that, women are making all these decisions. So it's important to involve other members of the household, men who are controlling the resources, mothers-in-law who are also making decisions, and then also the community at large to make these things change. But do we know enough about improving knowledge leads to changes in behaviors? We don't know a lot about that, and the constraints and the barriers and facilitators of adoption of improved practices. So I think more resources or more research needs to be done around, are there resource constraints, are there time constraints, are there social norms that are preventing people from changing behaviors, cognitive burdens, supply side constraints. And then lastly, do we need to think about other pedagogical approaches, to deliver these messages? Do we need better community needs assessment so that the messages are tailored to the needs of the community? Participatory methods such as PLA, which have shown to work in these contexts, and some maybe perhaps practical demonstrations like cooking demonstration, etc. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neha. Next up, we have Gianna Bonis-Profumo from the Charles Darwin University. Her presentation is titled Measuring Women's Empowerment in Agriculture, Food Production, and Child and Maternal Dietary Diversity in Post-Conflict Timor-Leste. So over to you, Gianna. Please unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. Can you see the shared screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. So thanks a lot for the opportunity to present this study. So this is the second paper of my PhD, and it's co-authored with my supervisors, Natasha Stacey and Julia Brimblecom, and which was funded through Charles Darwin University and the BCFN Foundation in partnership with the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries of the Timor-Leste government and CRS. So women's empowerment is essential to improve nutrition in low middle income countries, and it's conceptualized as one of the main pathways by which rural populations practicing agricultural livelihoods can achieve nutritional outcomes. However, quantifying and comparing empowerment across contexts is difficult, as it can have different meanings depending on the sociocultural, economic, and political landscape that people live in. So we investigated the relationship between measures of women's empowerment in agriculture and household food production on the dietary diversity of children 12 to 59 months old and their mothers among smallholders in post-conflict Timor-Leste. And so this relationship remains understudied in the Southeast Asia region. So we conducted a cross-sectional survey among a large convenient sample of households participating in a nutrition intervention with agriculture and animal components. So the program was used as an engagement platform for the study reported here, so it wasn't an impact evaluation. So we analyzed 156 dual adult rural households from 4 villages in 2 districts, and we obtained ethics approval from both Australia and Timor-Leste. And further details on the sampling strategy are shown in our publication. So in terms of methods, our nutrition outcomes were the dietary diversity scores, or DDS, of women and children, which have 10 and 7 groups respectively, and are based on 24 hours dietary records. And this indicator has shown strong correlations with direct measures of macronutrient adequacy and can predict dietary quality. And so we modeled the outcome variables as continuous instead of the dichotomous indicators of minimum dietary diversity, because in this instance, less than 10% of the sampled mothers and children achieved their respective cutoff, and that was for data collected in June 2018. So explanatory variables included the Abbreviated Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, the AWI, which is a multidimensional index designed to measure the empowerment, agency, and inclusion of women in the agriculture sector, and collects individual level data by interviewing a woman and a man within the same household. So we used 6 individual and 3 aggregate empowerment indicators totaling 9 models. Additionally, we used the Production Diversity Index, which is the number of food groups produced by the household, mirroring the 10 food groups in the DDS for women. So we applied the ordinary least squares multivariable regressions models and control for individual household and agrogeographic characteristics. And so I'd like to add that, yeah, we assess for the potential indigeneity of empowerment and production measures through the instrumental variable technique. But this performed unsatisfactorily, and as these were in fact exogenous to the nutrition outcomes. But more on this again in the paper. So this is very exciting because it's the first application of a women's empowerment in agriculture index tool in Timor-Leste, and it serves as a pilot really to examine the empowerment and diets relationship. So let's see what we found. So we first visualized the relationship between women's empowerment and dietary diversity scores of children through a spine plot. The x-axis shows empowerment categorized in 3 levels based on the 5 domains of empowerment, 5DE, showing an incremental distribution where over half scored high empowerment or over 80% achievement. And so the y-axis shows the distribution of children's DDS by food groups consumed, which range between 1 and 5. So what we find is that there's a bit of an uneven pattern of allocation between food groups and empowerment level. Whereas for women, the same spine plot shows that as empowerment levels increase, the proportion of women who consumed more food groups is higher. So next, we look at the results from this highly simplified table, and that shows the results on the regression models on the associations between empowerment indicators, food production, and children's and women's dietary diversity scores. So we found that being empowered, the binary indicator, was associated with higher children's as well as women's DDS by close to half the food group, while the aggregate empowerment score was highly significant for women, but not for children. And in this case, our p-value was 0.070, and we think that that's probably due to our small sample size. On the other hand, we have the production diversity index, which was strongly significant for children's DDS. So for instance, every additional food group produced by the household, the children's DDS increased by 1/10 of a food group, which was an effect that was constant across models and highly significant for most of them. So now we look at the individual empowerment indicators for the away, the 6, which were correlated with dietary diversity. And so we find for children that were ownership of assets and maternal group membership, whereas for women, it was only decisions on credit. And in contrast, we found several indicators that were not associated with neither DDS, production and income decisions, time spent working, and intra-household inequality. So we found that different measures of empowerment might be important for dietary quality, as our mixed results show in Timor-Leste, which is consistent with the literature in other LMIC in terms of a variety of indicators that may be associated with nutrition outcomes. And just very briefly, we found small gender gaps in production decisions, access to resources, and income control, which is similar to findings in other Southeast Asian countries. And we contribute with further empirical evidence to a regional pattern of fairly equitable gender relations in agriculture. So when we position our results in the pathways from agriculture to nutrition outcomes, we found that women's empowerment, specifically intra-household decision-making and resource allocation, but not prolonged workloads in this case, as well as food production, were important drivers of dietary diversity. So our results show that empowerment and production diversity are associated with improved diets. To conclude, this study was undertaken among rural smallholders with limited access to material resources in a fragile setting, where women's agency in agriculture emerged as a significant factor in the achievement of dietary outcomes. Our results show that nutrition-sensitive policies and programs in Timor-Leste could gain from prioritizing women's empowerment and promoting agriculture diversification strategies to improve the diets and well-being of mothers and children. So this study was just published by the Food Policy Journal, which we're very proud about. And I'd like to thank the participants, the research team, as well as the partners and funders who made this research possible, as well as this little one who has been crunching the numbers with me. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jana, and congrats both on the publication and the little one. So next up, we have Solange Cullen from University College Cork, and she's going to be presenting on women's economic and nutritional empowerment, a case study of the Gergera Watershed Project in Tigray region, Ethiopia. So over to you, Solange.
Thank you so much. So yes, I'll be presenting the findings of our research on women's economic empowerment in agriculture, nutritional empowerment, and the linkages to nutritional outcomes of households in Gergera Watershed, Tigray, Ethiopia. This study was the second round of data collection on women's economic empowerment in the area. It was part of a collaboration between University College Cork, Mykele University in Tigray, and in association with ICRAF and UCC's Action Research Program. I just want to mention before I start that these results show the situation of the area during the first half of 2020, before the current conflict that started in October last year. So these findings don't reflect the current humanitarian crisis in Tigray. So our methodology for our study was to apply the 5 dimensions of empowerment from the abbreviated Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. And we used this to measure empowerment and to identify the main barriers to increased empowerment in agriculture. We applied the recently developed Women's Empowerment in Nutrition Index, or the WENI, which was developed by Sudha Narayan and her colleagues. And we used this to measure the extent of nutritional empowerment and to assess if the empowerment correlated with nutritional incomes. Our nutrition metrics used were household and women's diet diversity scores, food consumption scores, and health metrics such as BMI and hemoglobin readings were used. Our study surveyed a total of 405 households, consisting of female respondents living in both male and female-headed households. Here we have the 5 dimensions of empowerment results. And the total 5D score was 0.56, which is classified as disempowered. And for respondents within female-headed households, it was 0.5, and in male-headed, 0.59. Overall, 50.1% of women were empowered according to the 5D. I'll quickly run through the main contributors to disempowerment in female versus male-headed households. The main contributor to disempowerment of women in female-headed was workload, the overburdening women. This was followed by leadership or group membership and input into productive decision-making. Similarly, in male-headed households, the largest contributor was workload. However, in male-headed households, it represents a larger contribution than in female-headed. This is due to having more access to agricultural activity and therefore having to allocate more time to productive work. Similarly, again, leadership was the second largest, followed by input into production decisions. On to the Women's Empowerment in Nutrition Index. So the WENI is a complementary set of indicators that captures the pathways leading to women's empowerment in nutrition. So by using the WENI, we gathered information on women's knowledge about and say over nutritional health practices, gaining access to and control over intake of healthy diets, and access to support from within the community and other institutions to secure adequate food and nutrition. For each respondent, there's a set of indicators associated with 7 domain dimensions measuring women's knowledge, resource, agency, and achievements in the domains of food, health, and institutions. For women of a reproductive age, there's 10 domain dimensions as we add fertility. These are the results of the WINI. So the total sample using 7 domain dimensions showed that 63.7% of women are categorized as nutritionally empowered, and of women between the ages of 18 and 49, when we added the 3 domains of fertility, knowledge, resource, and agency, 71.9 were nutritionally empowered. Again, we can see the main contributors to nutritional disempowerment. So looking at the 7 domain dimensions, health, knowledge, and food knowledge are the two main contributors, followed by health agency. When we applied the 10 domains, Fertility knowledge, food knowledge, and health knowledge are the three main contributors, meaning that the main constraint to increase nutritional impairment is lack of access to information, education, and knowledge. Here we have the women's impairment status of each index. We can see that female-headed households are less empowered than male-headed households in the A way, Winnie, and for those empowered in both. So just under 40% of women achieved impairment according to both indices. So to address the main causes of disempowerment, a focus must be put on female-headed households. They have less access to production and resources. By using both indices, we were able to go beyond the analysis of an impairment index on economic resources and linkages to separate food nutrition indicators. We introduced the concept of nutritional impairment so we could examine the socio-economic context of women's capabilities to achieve both impairment and increased nutrition. Here is one of our most significant findings of our research. So we can see that household diet diversity scores and women's diet diversity scores are higher in male-headed households and those who are empowered. This reflects the pattern throughout our results that women living in male-headed households are actually scoring higher than female-headed. There is a difference between household diet diversity between empowered and disempowered households. However, women's diet diversity does not vary more than 0.2 across all categories. So the relationship between household diet diversity, the 5DE, and Winnie scores has a positive correlation. However, there's no correlation with women's individual diet diversity between their diet diversity and economic and nutritional impairment scores. So I'll quickly, just the main thing to take away from our nutritional outcomes is that 41.9% of women are underweight. Again, there was no correlation between BMI scores and the Winnie scores, and the prevalence of anemia for non-pregnant women was 24.3%. I'm just going to finish with some of key messages that we found. The high prevalence of underweight women is definitely a concern. Although household diet diversity correlates with impairment, women's individual diet diversity did not, and this should be considered for future interventions. There's need for more nutritional extension work to improve knowledge around healthy diets. And in terms of nutritional impairment, the biggest barrier we find is access to information and knowledge. And in terms of economic impairment in agriculture, it's workload and the overburdening of women. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you. Looking forward to any questions.
Thanks so much. Next up, and our last presentation for this session is Anya McCarthy from Lewis and Clark College, who's going to be presenting on the Pastoralists Empower impact of a food security program on women's agency in northern Tanzania. Anya, if you could share your screen, please, and unmute yourself.
Hi, everybody. Can you see that all right?
We can see it. Thanks.
Great. Okay. I'm going to stand because I missed pre-COVID conferences. Okay, so this paper, as Misbah mentioned, is about the impact of a food security program. And our research question is about the impact. Again, it's a food security program. It's also a women's empowerment program, and it is in northern Tanzania. So the context of this study is important because we study the Maasai tribe, which is historically quite a patriarchal society. It's in northern Tanzania and in southern Kenya as well. And an important thing to note is that there are actually few Swahili speakers, especially among the women, and that's the national language of Tanzania. So the geographic regions that we study are in northeastern Tanzania. It's the Longido and Simanjiro districts. And we are, in terms of measuring women's empowerment, the effect on women's empowerment, just like many of the folks in this session, we are looking at the effect on the PRO-WEA, which is the project level women's empowerment measurement. So the project itself, which was alluded to by Agnes in the first presentation, was called Myasia Bora, and there were several key components. This was a pretty wide program and had a lot of different moving parts, but I'll discuss each of the components. The first one was really a focus on access to credit and to business training, and that was mostly through the formation of microcredit groups, small microcredit groups for women. A lot of the women that started small businesses also received training. There was another big component focus on nutrition and on school level vegetable gardens and household level vegetable gardens to improve household nutrition. There was a big livestock component, and that focused a lot on health of livestock and on vaccination. The Maasai tribe is also very centered around the cow. So there was a lot of emphasis on the health of cattle, though the livestock component also brought chickens into this tribe and especially focused on women and chickens. 3 other components of the program were on women's rights, and there were some focus groups to discuss legal rights of women and intimate partner violence, which in this context, that baseline is very high and is sort of a culturally entrenched practice. The last component is a focus on water and the logistics and management of water within each of these very rural and remote villages in Tanzania. The theory of change of the Myasia program, so the way that we think that the program might actually affect women's empowerment, is really through creating the settings that might create access to the sources of empowerment. So the settings include access to credit and to markets through those microcredit groups that I mentioned, through increasing information about livestock, sanitation, nutrition, and business, through social capital, that's that group formation focus, and alleviating time constraints for women, specifically for fetching water. The data collection was, the baseline was in 2016. The end line was 2019 to 2020. We were very lucky that it all happened just pre-COVID. There were 14 villages in our sample and about 1,000 individuals, almost 3/4 of which were women. This is, again, a pastoralist tribe, so it's more difficult to reach men who typically travel with the cows, and there's a bit of a migration as they look for water. Our empirical strategy for determining the effect of the program on women's empowerment employs 2 methods. First, just the difference in difference regression analysis, where we're looking at the effect of the interaction between the dummy variable for treatment status and time, which is, that would be beta 1 in this slide. And then we also use the difference in difference with propensity score matching and inverse probability treatment weighting, because our treatment villages and comparison villages were not selected randomly. So this is a slide that is kind of like drinking water out of a fire hose, but it is awesome. So stick with me here. So the upper left-hand corner shows the empowerment score. That's that continuous measurement of empowerment that several folks have mentioned so far. And it's comprised of these individual indicators, which are the rest of these small images. These are, and then the bars show the baseline levels and the end line levels for both the comparison and the treatment groups. So the second and fourth bars show the baseline treatment group and the end line treatment group. So for example, for decisions or for access to and decisions on credit, which is this one, if you can see my mouse, you can see that there was this improvement in access to credit in our treatment group, But also, interestingly, there was an improvement in access to credit in the comparison group. So that's something that we're seeing in several of these indicators, again, including group membership. So because of that and some unpredictability, for example, like the persistence of domestic violence, sort of unchangingness that we see there, when we examine the impact of the program on the overall empowerment score, that's that continuous measurement, we do not see an effect, no statistical significance of the treatment at endline. And then looking at these intrinsic measurements of empowerment, zero effect again. We do see an effect on collective agency, that's that group membership. And we see an effect on access to and decisions on credit. So women in the treatment groups are 8 percentage points more likely to have access to credit at endline. However, we saw a negative effect on input into productive decisions, which, as somebody else mentioned before, this is a little bit disappointing and surprising and requires a little bit more look into the qualitative, which I will get to if there's questions about that. And then we wanted to look at some correlations. So this previous slide is showing the impact evaluation results, but the next two slides show correlations between women's empowerment level and a couple of interesting health outcome variables. So when we look at food security, this is interesting because we show that women that are more empowered have greater dietary diversity in their households. That's column 1 and column 2. However, they show lower levels of dietary diversity for themselves, which is something to think a little bit more seriously about. However, the results on intimate partner violence show somewhat as predicted that more empowered women experience less violence. Though it's interesting that there's some nuance within there. And this first column shows the attitudes towards domestic violence, which didn't show that the empowerment score changed, that more empowered women had any different attitudes about intimate partner violence. Okay, those are our results so far. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks so much, Anya. Great. So thanks, everyone, for keeping in time. We have about 15 minutes left for question answers and discussions. And I see that we have quite a few questions already in the chat box. And thanks to everyone who's already answered some of them already. If there's anybody who would like to come in, please feel free to use the raise your hand function and ask your question in person. But just looking at some of the questions in the chat box, and I know this has already been answered, but because this has come up a couple of times, I wonder, Agnes, perhaps if you had any comments on the question on whether time or the length of the projects matter. So, you know, measuring between baseline and end line, are we measuring too soon? And how does that sort of, you know, do you think that could impact some of the results you find? And again, if anybody else apart from Agnes, one of the other presenters have thoughts on that, you know, given their projects, please feel free to come in.
Thanks for this question, Ms. Ba, and whoever asked it. I think a number of people asked this question. I think we're very aware that many impacts on empowerment may require a longer duration to actually be manifested. And we are constrained by the very short time frame of evaluation of projects, implementation, and of evaluation period. So that is really a constraint that we face. So what would be really nice is to do a follow-up study. And we're hoping that some interested donors will fund this down the line. So we had in fact planned to go back to one of our projects in Bangladesh, but that has been on hold because of the pandemic. It is a serious situation right now. But in the future, we hope.
Thanks, Agnes. Would anybody else on the presentation panel like to come in on this question? Great. Moving on to another question that's been asked by Diana Dalaman, and I think this goes out to all of the presenters, but please, Diana, feel free to correct me. She asked if there was any other type of knowledge transfer analyzed. And I think perhaps this goes to Solange. And if there are any specific context-specific knowledge transfers that could improve women's empowerment.
Yeah, I think in terms of knowledge transfers, we found even from our 2019 research that a lot of the extension programs to do with agriculture were targeted at men. And there was a real push for women wanted to set up their own collective agricultural groups. However, there was just that knowledge gap because they're getting almost secondhand information. And equally, I think the knowledge transfer between a lot of the nutrition extension work is getting targeted at women. And so therefore, they're getting knowledge, but it's very specific to women's issues, if you know what I mean. So I think there needs to be more dual targeted extension work. A lot of the knowledge that I would talk about in terms of the Winnie was especially around fertility. It would be knowledge around fertility, knowledge around where you can access help or information, or especially support. So I think that's what we would focus on. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Sorry. And Neha, I know you've also answered this question in the chat box, but there was a question about the role of BCC and what it how that sort of plays in all these relationships. It's from Mona Gadrian, who wonders if any elements of BCC may enhance agency because participatory approaches have proven to be fruitful in some scenarios. So yeah, if you would like to come in and answer that question, and if any of the other presenters as well would like to sort of comment on how targeted BCC approaches could play a role in perhaps improving some of these impacts on women's empowerment.
Sure, thanks, Misbah. Yeah, I think, and I'll be borrowing from another project that I was not involved in, but at IFPRI we talk to our colleagues a lot. So this was work in Bangladesh where BCC was delivered to mothers in a group, and the objective of that intervention was to improve nutrition. But what the researchers found was that had impacts, very high positive impacts on women's empowerment. And so while it was not designed in a way for us to say, well, this is, it's because of the BCC, what we conjecture is that it's probably a combination of being able to meet with your peers, discussing, coming together, just kind of having this safe space, may have led to these positive impacts. So it's possible, not so much the BCC alone, but like how it's delivered. And I'll share an anecdote from back in maybe 2017 or 18 when I was in India in doing some field work with the Pradhan villages, and we were interviewing some men. And we were like, so, they were telling us that women are so empowered, they have access to these groups, so they have all this power. So I think the group-based dissemination is definitely empowering. And I don't know so much about the BCC, but maybe information is power too. So, the combination plays out in that way. And I see Agnes's hand is up. Maybe she can add.
I was actually going to add in relation to the question on knowledge transfers, and it's also related to what Neha is saying, that the type, how you target knowledge and to which person in the household matters, because one of the projects in the GAP2 portfolio is a project in Bangladesh called the Agriculture, Nutrition, Gender Linkages Project, or ANGEL. And in this one, which is an RCT of agriculture, extension training, nutrition BCC, and gender sensitization training, these were randomized. The training was provided to husbands and wives together. And so it wasn't that nutrition went to women only and agriculture went to men only. And what we actually found in the evaluation was that the intervention regardless of treatment arm increased women's empowerment, but the nutrition treatment arm actually empowered men. And we found that we hypothesized that this is because men were being exposed to an area of decision-making that was not their sphere at all. And both men and women say that they appreciated having the training being done jointly. For example, I just happen to have a proof in front of me, which says, like, as we both attended Angel training, we know that taking decisions together is good. After participating in Angel, my wife could take the right decision, and sometimes the husband's decision is wrong. And this was a man who was saying this. So they do speak to the benefit of having husbands and wives trained together and sort of opening up a forum for dialogue for them to talk about these issues, which they had never talked about together before.
Thanks, Agnes. And a question from my side, and I was wondering when you were presenting whether the type of intervention, mattered in terms of, for those interventions that there were some impacts on empowerment. So I know you showed like the distinguishing the differences between Africa and Asia, but the intervention itself, so whether it was something with more self-help group or a value chain intervention, did that play a role in some of these pathways?
I think it does play a role, but I think one thing that I did not mention during my presentation is that the African sites are a lot poorer, and so are probably working with a lot more constraints than the Asia projects. And I think that there was probably more intentional programming around changing gender norms in the Asia projects.
Thanks. And I see we have another question. I think that goes to you as well, Agnes, but please, other presenters, I think it could be relevant to you as well. This is from Janlo, who asks, if in the analysis of the different projects, were you able to sort by the degree of participation in the project activities themselves, and how that influenced degree of empowerment or other benefits obtained?
I can quickly respond to that while others think. So we, in our work, we did look at that by only focusing on women who are SAG members. So that's one way for us to kind of define program participation, and we don't actually find any differences in the impact. So.
Jessica, Agnes, Anya.
We tried to separate out by the different areas of the project, but because there were so many different aspects happening in the villages, we found that respondents were unfamiliar with maybe the international organization name because they were all implemented by local partners, and so had a hard time directly linking to the projects. And so making that connection when we would ask, there wasn't necessarily an association name with the organization. And so the data was messy and we had a hard time actually disaggregating it.
Also, just to add to that, building off of what Agnes said, our context was an extremely poor area in northern Tanzania, very, very poor, very, very remote. And so, like Brooke mentioned, it was a very multifaceted program, really trying to do women's empowerment, but also just trying to like alleviate some of the budget constraints that these households face that are just enormous. And so, because it was such a multifaceted program, it's possible that some folks got access to the like poultry and nutrition intervention, but maybe didn't click as much with some of the gender interventions as well, because they're just trying to put food on the table.
In our case in Burkina Faso with the Seleve project, I did sort of allude to, but not present in depth, the treatment on the treated effects. So that would look at essentially if there were program impacts on those who did participate. And And we didn't find any significant impact in those cases, or when we did those analyses. So yeah, we're doing some more in-depth analyses on different aspects of program participation, et cetera, that we'd want to look at more, but so that's where we are at this point.
So actually in the Bangladesh project, so there were several Bangladesh projects in the portfolio, but in the Angel project, there was actually very good participation and very high fidelity of implementation. I mean, these are pilot projects, so it's like you have like the ideal conditions, and it's being scaled up now. I'm actually curious to see how it's going to perform in scale up. But I think one of the nice things about this project was that we were actually able to randomize the agriculture, the nutrition, and the gender sensitization trainings, and to look at the additive effect of the of each of the different types of training. So I thought that it helps us unpack these effects, but certainly there's more to be done on unpacking why certain interventions work better than others. There was another project in the GAP2 portfolio, which was being implemented jointly by HKI and BRAC. This is the farm project, and it also had very positive results on empowerment. And both of them used some of the HKI approach, which we also use in our project, which really involved, not only targeting women, but talking to the husband, mothers-in-law, communities, etc. So it was a really broader attempt to try to change gender norms by working within the structures that the woman herself were embedded in.
Thanks, Agnes. And we have about 2-3 minutes left. Just one last question. This comes from Diana Dalleman, and it's more of a general question. So again, goes out to all of our panelists. Taking advantage that we have so many experts in women's empowerment here, Diana asks if there's any study of any work done that shows any different impacts on empowerment if it's addressed at an earlier age, so at the level of adolescence. So a bit more general. If, Diana, if you'd like to come in and ask something more specific. Otherwise, I open this to our 6 presenters.
I can chime in a bit. I'm not aware of any studies that look at women's empowerment and agriculture specifically over sort of the developmental life course period. I think one of the biggest issues that we deal with is addressing the fact that there would be different ways of measuring agency or empowerment depending on the developmental stage of the individual. We don't want our 12-year-old adolescents to be making the same decisions that we want our 25-year-old daughters to make. And so thinking about like what's meaningfully developmentally over that period, I think we have a long way to go on thinking through, and there is work on measuring empowerment and agency in younger age groups, but in terms of thinking through those developmental pathways, I still think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done before good studies on that can be put together and designed.
Thanks, Jessica. Would anybody else like to chime in?
Oh, I'd like to just mention about a research that I was not involved with but in Timor-Leste there was some studies showing that the gender attitudes get formed at a younger age, and so the older there was a study done in early adolescence, covering everything from year 10 to 19, and they were showing how among boys, as age was increasing, their attitudes toward gender were becoming more conservative. So that would suggest that interventions supporting sensitization on gender attitudes should start early in order to support the development of gender norms and perceptions from an early age. So maybe not so much on the agriculture side of things, but on the gender norms, there's maybe a lot of interesting work to do at that early age and through the schooling system, perhaps. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So unless there's any other questions from the audience, we're at time. So just very quickly to wrap up, I'd like to thank the presenters once again for their great presentations, for everyone for their questions. And it seems from what Agnes has said and other colleagues on their presentations mentioned that a lot of papers have been written up on what's being presented today. So yeah, lots to look out for in the near future. There is some announcements from the ANH team on the closing ceremony today, and a few things about the material for from today's presentation being online. So I'll hand over from them. From my side, thanks once again, and hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Misbah. Can everybody hear me now? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to launch a poll. This is just a few questions to help us improve the next session. We hope you'll fill it out before you go. I'll launch it now. You can send any questions to anh-academy@lshtm.ac.uk. And I will launch that now. And then while you're filling that out, I would just like to say, please do join us in there will be in about 15 minutes, we'll have a closing ceremony where we will announce the results of the poster sessions and say a very warm thank you and that we miss you, seeing you in person and all of those good things. So please do join us for that. And then we have a social hangouts following that, where we can have more of an informal time to say hello to friends. And we're going to do it on Spatial this year, so you'll have a chance to meet people in different rooms. So let's see if you can all, I don't see so many responses from the poll. If you can, please make sure to fill that out before we go. That would be so helpful for us. And thank you so much for participating. And we will see you soon.